So I want you to grab a piece of paper, or you can grab the card in front of you if you got something, or you can get out your smartphone, I guess, whatever. You're going to write something down here. We're going to do something together because I know you probably just haven't had time to do this yet. Life is so busy, but you've got to do this, right? Because Christmas is coming, so you need to do this. You need to make your Christmas list, okay? Come on, what do you want? What do you want for Christmas this year? Write it down. I know you've got some ideas in your head. What would you love to find under the tree this coming Christmas? Or go ahead, just write a few things down. Go ahead. I'm just kind of talking right now while you're doing that. Hopefully you've got a few of those figured out. Actually, I'm going to do it myself here. Let me grab a card here. Got my piece of paper here. Just use this. Yep. You guys all doing this? Yep. Good. I don't think I even have a pencil. Probably should have grabbed one before I came up here. Let's see if I got one right here. Oh, thanks, honey. Oh, that'll work. Oh, goodness. This is not how I anticipated the beginning of this message going. Okay. So writing it down. Oh, I got lots of things here. I'll just jot a few things down. I'm not going to tell you what they are here. Okay. Yep. Oh, that's going to be awesome. And this. Oh, yeah. And I'll just do one more. Okay. You guys got yours too? Got your Christmas list? Right? Okay, you ready for this? Tear it up. You don't need it. You don't need any of the things on your Christmas list. Today, we are continuing in our series on the letters of John. John was one of the apostles, one of Jesus' closest followers, and he writes these letters to the faith community, the Christian community, about 60 years after the life and ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus. We believe that John lived in the city of Ephesus, which is in modern-day Turkey. And so he writes a series of letters, which we have just been going through. And these letters all have one central theme. There's one particular issue that is motivating John to write these, and it's the question of who is Jesus. We see that these letters are written in response to basically a church split. The church is divided. There is a group within the church that has broken off from the faith of the original disciples. They're beginning to teach some things about Jesus that are not in accordance with the faith that was held by John and by the early apostles. And so these letters are there to help correct and help the church maintain faith in who Jesus really is. Now, the first letter, which we actually finished last week, and is the largest of the three letters, it was what's known as a circular letter, meaning it was written to a bunch of churches. The idea was it would be read in one church, and then it would be taken to the next city where it would be read in that church, that sort of thing. Now, this letter that was just read, it's 2 John, is a sort of a follow-up letter to that first letter. But this letter is written to a specific church, not to all of them in general. And this emerges here in the very opening. Right? It says here, the elder, here this is referring to John, the elder to the elect lady and her children. Now, there is some debate about, okay, what does he mean, the elect lady? I mean, maybe he's talking about a specific woman. But actually, most scholars think that this is sort of code, and he's working off of a metaphor that we find throughout the Bible, and that is that oftentimes God's people are seen as the bride of God. God is the groom, we are the bride. We find this in the New Testament. Christ is the bride, his church is the bride, Christ is the groom, and the church is the bride. And so it seems like he's using that metaphor to talk about a church. Some actually think that perhaps the reason that he's doing this is that there was persecution going on, cultural persecution, possibly even state-sponsored persecution against Christians. So perhaps he's just trying to not draw attention to the fact that this is a religious letter. We don't know for sure. But the point is, it seems that he's writing this to a specific church. Now, before we get into what I think is at the heart of this letter, I need to address the elephant in the room. Right, y'all know what an elephant in the room is, right? I want you to imagine right now that there was actually an elephant right here behind me, and I want you to imagine that I just went on talking and went on with my sermon, but didn't deal with, like, hey, Kevin, there's an elephant in the room, right? You wouldn't be able to hear anything else that I said. Well, there's an elephant in the room that emerges from this text, which many of you may have seen. It's an elephant in a room that I think there's something in this letter that jars our modern sensibilities. There's something in this letter that comes out, and it seems, I think many of us would seem to think of it as a little inappropriate, almost a little unchristian. And here's what it is. We find it here in verses 9 through 10. What John is doing here is he's warning the church about this group that has broken off. And he's warning them about them and about their teaching and how they should respond if they come into contact with them. This is what it says here. Everyone who goes on ahead and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God. Whoever abides in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house or give him any greeting. For whoever greets him takes part in his wicked works. Like, really, John? You mean if they come to my door, they come to my house, and they knock on the door, and I open it up, like, I should open it up like 2 inches, and kind of peer, see who it is, and then if you see who it is, like, go away, and slam the door on them? Is this how I'm supposed to treat them? It seems to be suggesting if I run into one of them at the grocery store, I'm in aisle 10, and they start coming down, well, you should move over to aisle 11. If you come across one of these folks, maybe your son plays basketball, and you're at one of his basketball games, and one of his teammates, well, his family's part of this church that broke off, right? And if you see them there, and let's imagine that you were in charge of snacks that day, well, no snacks for that kid. No, right? That's kind of what it seems like. And, of course, this very much jars our modern sensibilities. It goes against the first and greatest commandment. The first and greatest commandment of our modern age. Of course, what is that? Thou shalt not be intolerant. It seems like John is being incredibly intolerant of these. Okay, they have different views. That's fine, but you should still welcome them in, right? I mean, welcome everybody in. Be hospitable to them. Be tolerant of their views. Is sort of the approach that I think many of us think is appropriate. Okay, well let me address this here. First of all, we need to understand a little more of what's going on here historically. The first thing we need to see is that in the Greco-Roman world, if you traveled to another city, which is what's going on here, it's talking about missionaries from this other group that had split off, them coming into a new town, a town where they don't live, a town where they are strangers. In the Greco-Roman world, if you came into a town where you were a stranger, you actually were not afforded the same rights as a person who lived there locally. Unless, of course, you were a Roman citizen, then you kind of got all of the rights, or at least you were supposed to. But if you weren't a Roman citizen, which probably most of the early church, they would not have been Roman citizens, if you came into a new town, you did not receive the protections of others. The only way you would get that is if somebody in that town sort of endorsed you, said, they're with me, I back them 100%. So what's going on here is that if these folks come to one of the homes of John's community and they welcome them in, it's as if they're saying to the community, hey, we endorse these people. We endorse everything that they're about. And John's saying, you can't do that. Right now, also, secondly, what we need to notice here is that when they're coming to their house, it's important to recognize what a house in the Christian world in the first century often operated as. To put it a different way, they did not have church buildings, the early Christians, that first generation. And so when they would gather together to worship, they would gather together to worship in their homes, right? It was a house church movement. And so it seems probably what he's really getting at here is that these folks from the church split, they're wanting to come to your house church so that they can teach, right? It's like, hey, let me come and share what we've come to learn, what we think we know about you. Let us share that in your church. And so John's saying, no, wait a minute. You can't let them come and share what they're teaching, which is not in accordance with the early apostles. You can't have them come into your church, right? That's all he's trying to do here. This is not an issue of what we might call intolerance. This is just a man who has great convictions. And on this issue of tolerance, if I may for a moment here, just say that as popular as this phrase is, nobody really believes in tolerance if you go all the way. Okay, let me give you an example of what I mean by this. I want you to imagine this is an election year. I mentioned this last week as well. But at some point here, we're going to have the Republican National Convention, right? And I don't exactly know how all that works, but the organizers will decide who's going to speak at the Republican National Convention. Now, I want you to imagine that Hillary Clinton showed up at the Republican National Convention and said, "Hey, can I have some time? Can I speak?" Right? Now, imagine if they said no. Now, would we think they were being intolerant? Well, of course not. No, what is Hillary Clinton doing at the Republican National Convention? And vice versa. If Donald Trump shows up at the Democratic National Convention and wants to speak and they say no, is that intolerant? No, of course not. We realize that they're coming from different perspectives. And that's really all that John is saying. It's not like John is telling them to go out and hunt down these heretics and burn them at the stake. You see the difference? So this isn't intolerance. This is just a man who should be commended for his conviction. Now, the question then emerges is, why does he hold so strongly to these convictions? Why is this so important to him? And I think that if we ask that question, that's a good segue to lead into what I would suggest is really the heart of this letter. If I were to sum up what John wants to communicate to this church and to us today, it's just simply this. If you have Jesus, you have everything. If you lose Jesus, you lose everything. It's that simple. If you have Jesus, you have everything. If you lose Jesus, you lose everything. First of all, if you have Jesus, you have everything. I've shared a number of times a little bit about my conversion story. When I was about 12 years old, I went to a church camp just outside of Casper, Wyoming, and I remember after singing worship songs around a campfire, I just felt the Spirit of God coming over me, and I remember walking out into a field and just saying, "God, I surrender my life to you." And what I remember, and I think about this now, right, as someone who now has gone to seminary and has studied the Bible and studied theology academically, and I didn't have any of those kinds of theological concepts or resources when I was 12 years old, and I think about what was going on in my heart and in my mind, and I can tell you the one thing that stands out about that experience is somehow when I was 12 years old, I had this sense. I said to myself, "Kevin, in this moment, you have everything you will ever need." It was such a weird sensation. Like, I'm 12. I'm like, I have my entire life ahead of me. But something in me just knew that, well, actually, you now have everything that you need. You see, if you have Jesus, you have everything. Friends, this is why I told you to tear up your Christmas list. Because you know what? You don't really need what's on it. I mean, unless Jesus was on it. I mean, if you put, "I want more of Jesus," then I'm sorry I had you tear it up. Get some Scotch tape. I'll give you some. You can put it back together. But if you put anything on there other than Jesus, guess what? You don't really need it. It could be argued. You could make a strong argument that I need a new car. You could. When I came here to church this morning, it's in that place now where some things aren't working right. But to me, it just has character. That's the way I see it, right? So I pull into the parking lot this morning, and I do what now has become routine. I'm kind of getting used to it. Is to get out of the car, I have to leave the power on so I can roll the window down so that I can reach my hand out and grab the outdoor door handle and then open it because the indoor door handle is broken, okay? Now, it's just not just that. Here's what's ironic about this. Then on the passenger side front door, it's the opposite. Right? If you want to get in the car from the outside, someone has to let you in because the outside door handle is broken off, right? Now, you can say, "Well, Kevin, why don't you just replace these door handles?" Have you seen how much a door handle costs? It is unbelievable how much they charge to replace a door handle on a car. And look, I realize it's probably less than getting a new car, maybe not, I don't know. But the truth is, I'm a little hesitant to do it because it kind of seems like maybe the transmission is slipping. Like sometimes I'm not sure if it's actually going to go into gear or not, so I'm not sure if I want to spend money on door handles if that's going out. Right, okay, so my point is you could make a strong argument, practically speaking, that I need a new car. Okay, maybe I do. But you know what? In the grand scheme of things, guess what? It's not really true. Because if you have Jesus, you have everything. Listen, I hope you get that promotion at work. I really do. I hope you do. You've worked hard for it. I hope you get it. But guess what? You don't need it. Maybe you're coming into finals week. You've got tests coming up, and you're aiming for straight A's. And, I hope you get those straight A's. I think working hard, using the gifts that God has given you for His glory, that's really important, and you should do everything you can to do well. But guess what? If you don't get those straight A's, guess what? You don't need them. Because if you have Jesus, you have everything. And you know what? What's interesting is if you realize this, right? If you realize you have everything in Jesus, look at this. The more you have Jesus, the less you will sin, okay? There's a connection here. The more you have Jesus, the less you will sin. And the reason why this is the case is because whenever we sin, it is always because there is something we think we need that we pursue at the exclusion of others. That's at the heart of sin. Is there something you're pursuing, you think you need it, and you go after it, and it ends up being at the exclusion of others? This is why. And we've seen throughout the letters of John, 1 John, and now here in John 2, as we'll see, like John is concerned about the faith community living in obedience to Jesus. This is an exhortation we've seen time and time and time again. And also what we've seen is that when he talks about obedience to God, primarily what he means is love for one another. That's how you are obedient to God, is by loving one another. And this emerges again in this passage here, verse 5 of John 2. And now I ask you, dear lady, not as though I were writing you a new commandment, but the one we have had from the beginning, that we love one another. John wants us to love one another. And of course, what he knows is that if you realize, if you have Jesus, you have everything. And when you realize you have everything, then you no longer need to pursue other things at the exclusion of others. It actually frees you to love. You see this? When you realize you have everything that you need, you don't need to pursue things at the exclusion of others. You're just free to love one another. So again, what is John doing here? What's the big picture here? He wants to remind us that in Jesus we have everything. We see this in verse 3. Grace, mercy, and peace will be with us from God the Father and from Jesus Christ, the Father's Son, in truth and love. Grace, mercy, and peace. Okay, what are grace, mercy, and peace? If you have grace plus mercy plus peace, do you know what you get? You get everything. Grace, mercy, peace, that's what everything is. Grace, mercy, and peace constitutes everything that you think you need and everything that you want. Let's just kind of work through these here. We're going to start with grace. What is grace? Grace is favor. Grace is acceptance. Grace is validation. The person who experiences the grace of God is a person who experiences validation. And isn't it true that validation is one of the greatest motivators in our lives? That just about everything that you do, everything that you put your work to, what's motivating, I think, a lot of us is the quest for validation. I'll give you an example. We'll just say this. We'll make it personal this morning. I'll make some of you uncomfortable. Actually, hopefully I'll make all of you uncomfortable. Then I know I've done my job. Okay. So some of you got to church on time today. You did. You got to church even early today, right? Congratulations. Can we clap for them, everybody? Some of you. Yep, good job, everybody. You know who you are. Now, here's my question for you. Those of you who were on time or early, What is it that motivated you to get here on time or early? Now, I hope maybe you're like, gosh, I really wanted to worship the Lord. And I do. I hope that's it. Hope you're like, I wanted to get here. I wanted to praise the Lord. I wanted to get here on time so that I didn't miss a song so I could worship. I hope that's it. But my suspicion is that that's not entirely the case. You see, I think for some of us, it's like, well, if I show up on time, people will think well of me. I'm a responsible individual. And what about some of you who maybe weren't on time today? You were late, and you're feeling kind of bummed about the fact that you were late to church today. And I'd love to believe that the reason why you're bummed, you're like, man, I missed that first song. I just love that. Oh, I can't believe I missed that. And oh, I missed announcements. Oh, they're always so riveting. I'm so bummed that I missed Kevin's announcements. I mean, maybe that's true, but my suspicion is that's not really why, if you're feeling bummed at all, you are. It's because you're like, well, I wonder what people think of the fact that I showed up late. You see, what motivates us so often is this quest for validation. I like to say that life, in some respects, just life in general, is one big giant attempt to prove yourself. That's life. It's one big giant attempt to prove yourself at school, at work, with your friends, in your neighborhood. It's one big giant attempt to prove yourself. I mean, Thanksgiving is often one big giant attempt to prove yourself, seek validation. Now, some of you may remember Thanksgiving last year, and it's been haunting you ever since, because you got together with your family, and you ended up having to have a conversation with your brother-in-law, and your brother-in-law said, hey, how's work going? And you had to tell him that you just got fired. And so all year since then, you've been like, man, I gotta make stuff happen this year, right? Because what you want to do is you want to be able to walk into Thanksgiving the next year because you know that brother-in-law is going to ask you again, how's work? And you want to be like, man, I just started a new business. We brought in $1 million. Right? That desire for validation is even affecting the way you think about Thanksgiving. This desire for validation is one of the reasons, I think, why we so often name drop. You know what name dropping is? Name dropping is when you mention somebody that you know that's maybe famous or successful and you like people to know that you know them. Right? Do you know anybody that's a name dropper? Anybody? I mean, and maybe it's you. Maybe you know somebody. I knew, and I won't say his name. I won't drop his name. But I know this guy, and he was always, it seemed like every time you get into a conversation with him, he would mention the fact that he knew Taylor Swift. Okay, it actually wasn't Taylor Swift. It was someone else. But we'll just go with Taylor Swift. We'll say that's who it was. It was somebody famous. We'll go with Taylor Swift. She's really popular. She's kind of a big deal these days. You know this, right? Taylor Swift? You guys know the Chiefs Eagles game this Monday Night Football? You guys fired up about that? The two best teams right now are the Chiefs and the Eagles. They played in the Super Bowl last year. They're the best teams this year, and they're playing on Monday Night Football. But that's not even what's so big about that particular event. Do you know what the big deal is? Apparently, Taylor Swift's parents are going to meet Travis Kelce's parents at that game. Like, it's a big deal, and I'm pretty sure that ESPN is going to have full coverage of it. They might show some of the game. We'll see. I don't know. Anyway, so she's kind of a big deal. So this friend of mine, it wasn't Taylor Swift, but we'll say that it was. And it's like every time you get into a conversation with him, he would find a way to mention the fact that he knew Taylor Swift. Because somehow it's sort of like it's validating, right, that you know somebody's successful. Friends, when you know Jesus, you have the ultimate name drop. So what were you doing yesterday? Well, I was hanging out with Jesus. Jesus, the creator of the universe. I mean, it is the mic drop, name drop. Friends, when you have Jesus, you come to realize that the God of the universe loves you, accepts you, welcomes you, validates you. You don't need anybody else's validation. That's grace. That's grace. When you have Jesus, you have everything. You have grace. Secondly, you have mercy. What is mercy? Mercy is forgiveness. I remember a number of years ago, I went on a canoeing trip in Canada. A buddy of mine invited me to go, and we spent 10 days just canoeing through these little lakes in Canada. It was gorgeous, beautiful. Had all of our camping gear, all of our food, just going around in our canoes. The one thing he didn't tell me is that from time to time we would have to portage the canoe. You know what that means? It means we'd have to pick the canoe up and carry it from one lake to the next with all of our stuff. He didn't tell me that when he invited me. Now, usually it was only like 10 yards or something like that. It wasn't that big of a deal. But there was this one time when literally I feel like it was half a mile. We had to carry this canoe. So for, half an hour, I'm carrying, 200 pounds is what it felt like. 200 pounds on my shoulders. Now, here's the thing. As I'm carrying this 200 pounds of weight, I'm walking through some of the most gorgeous scenery, right? Walk by a waterfall, walk by a creek, and look at the mountains. But here's the truth. I couldn't enjoy any of it, right? I can't enjoy the waterfall. I can't enjoy the mountain. I've got 200 pounds on my shoulders. The truth is, I think that some of us, we go through life carrying 200 pounds of guilt and shame that hinders us from being able to enjoy life. Friends, the heart of the Christian faith, the heart of God's mercy, is that he forgives you. Your guilt, your shame is gone. He died on the cross to absorb that guilt and that shame, that you might be able to walk in freedom. Friends, what do we have in Jesus? We have everything. We have grace, we have mercy. Third one, we have peace. Now, peace, what is peace? The biblical concept of peace is a word that can't really be captured with the English word peace. The Greek word is the Greek word hyrene, but we know that John, being Jewish, no doubt has in his mind the concept of the Hebrew word shalom. And there is no English word that captures what shalom, the breadth of shalom. I think the best definition I've ever seen for this word shalom comes from Cornelius Plantinga Jr., and I want to read this for you. The webbing together of God, humans, and all creation in justice, fulfillment, and delight is what the Hebrew prophets call shalom. We call it peace, but it means far more than mere peace of mind or a ceasefire between enemies. In the Bible, shalom means universal flourishing, wholeness, and delight. A rich state of affairs in which natural needs are satisfied and natural gifts fruitfully employed. A state of affairs that inspires joyful wonder at its creator as its Savior opens doors and welcomes the creatures in whom he delights. Shalom, in other words, is the way things ought to be. You see what John is saying when he says that peace will be ours? He's saying that because of Jesus, in Jesus, God will make all things the way they are supposed to be. God will put an end to all pain and suffering, all war, all disease, all hardship, all death. He will wipe all of that away, and he will enable you to become who God always intended you to be. Unhindered by whatever physical handicaps you have, unhindered by whatever social barriers have kept you down. He's saying that God will make things the way they are supposed to be. He will completely renew and restore all of creation. You see, John's saying in Jesus, we have everything. And this, going back to my conversion, that was the sense that I had. And of course, we see in this that there is an eschatological dimension to the peace, right? Because things are not yet the way they ought to be, right? But you see, when you come to know Jesus, you get a taste of the peace that is really from the future. It's a taste of the way things will be. What is it that John wants to remind us of? Is that if you have Jesus, you have everything. But there's a flip side to the same coin. And it's this. If you lose Jesus, you lose everything. Without Jesus, you lose grace. You lose mercy. You lose peace. This is what emerges here in verses 7 through 8. For many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. Such a one is the deceiver and the Antichrist. Watch yourselves so that you may not lose what we have worked for, but may win a full reward. Now, in this passage, John has something specific in mind. He talks about losing Jesus. Here, he's talking about losing the full picture of who Jesus is. Because, again, he's writing in response to this group that has broken off from the church, and they're still teaching things about Jesus. It's just that the Jesus of which they're teaching is not the same as the Jesus of the early faith community, the original disciples. So he's saying if you lose the accurate picture of Jesus, well, then you lose everything. And of course, what we've seen throughout this series is we've gotten a glimpse of what exactly was their understanding of Jesus and what was their worldview, this group that kind of had broken off. And what we saw was, we talked about Gnosticism, and we see that in this group that broke off, the seeds of what would later become in later church history, Gnosticism. And basically, for our purposes, at the root of this is this worldview that says that the physical world is bad and that the spiritual world is all that matters. And so salvation to one of these Gnostics, and if they involved Jesus in this salvation project, was simply Jesus coming and rescuing you from the evil physical world. It was your spirit just kind of being set free from the physical world, right? And so what you need to see about this is that this is not actually Jesus coming to fix the problem. This is Jesus helping you run away from the problem. It's not fixing what's wrong with our world. It's giving up on it. It's not fixing the problem. And so his point is, if you lose the real Jesus, you don't get fixing the problem. You just get this idea of running away from it. And of course, what is related to this is that they also did not believe in the incarnation of Jesus. They did not believe that God became flesh. And as we've seen throughout this series, what that means is that if God didn't become the flesh, then he did not get his hands dirty. He didn't actually enter into our world. He didn't come into the brokenness of our world. And then in his death, he didn't actually experience suffering. He didn't suffer on our behalf. He didn't actually take our sin upon himself. So you see, if you go with their Jesus, you lose Jesus. You lose grace. You lose mercy. You lose peace. If you lose Jesus, you lose everything. So about a month ago, Laura and I went and saw the movie Oppenheimer, which tells the story of Oppenheimer, this scientist who was in charge of the Manhattan Project, which was the American effort to develop the first nuclear bomb. And it's a fascinating, terrifying story. There's one part that I still it's unbelievable. There was a point in the process of developing the bomb, and I've read this elsewhere, so this isn't just Hollywood here. This is true. Where at some point during the development, they're creating something nobody really knew what would happen when they would split the atom or whatever it is that is. And some of the scientists, they're trying to kind of figure out what's going to happen when we do this. And as they ran their calculations, some of the physicists had come to the conclusion that there was a possibility, though very slight, but still a possibility, that when they ignited this bomb for the first time, it would cause a chain reaction that would cause the entire atmosphere of the earth to be ignited in flame and would kill everything on earth. Now, as we know, that is not what happened, but they were afraid that might happen, that they would lose everything. Friends, John is saying if you lose Jesus, that's exactly what happens. We lose everything. You know, it's interesting in the New Testament, during New Testament times, Christians, by the pagans in the Greco-Roman world, Christians were referred to as atheists. Christians were the atheists. And the reason for this is because in the Greco-Roman world, virtually everybody else worshiped many, many gods. They thought there were gods everywhere. Or they thought the sun was a god. They thought the moon was a god. They thought the trees were a god. But they thought the clouds were gods, whatever. And the Christians came along, and with their Old Testament kind of roots, they started to say, these things aren't gods, right? The sun isn't a god. It's a burning ball of hydrogen, right? Well, they didn't know that, but they knew that it was a thing. And the moon, it's not a god. It's a created thing. That's not a god. That's a tree, right? And so they're going on, and so they began to be seen as the atheists because they didn't believe in gods. What I think is interesting is that in our modern age, there's been what's known as demythologizing. This is part of the modern world in which secular folks have what they've claimed to demythologize the religious worldview. In other words, they take the religious myths and just show them that they're not true. Right? This is sort of at the heart of secular demythologizing. And of course, these modern folks, they think they're doing something new in this whole demythologizing project. The irony is that Christians were the first demythologizers. They were the ones saying, these aren't actually gods, these are just things. But the demythologizing of the Christians was done to actually bring clarity to the one myth they knew was true. The one story that was beyond what you can just see in the natural world. The myth of the story of the God of the Bible, the God who created all things. The myth of the story of the God who in Jesus came into this world on our behalf. The myth, which C.S. Lewis calls the myth that became fact. You see, they were the first demythologizers, except for here's the thing. The Christians put all of their eggs in one basket. And of course, what was that? That was the Jesus basket. But if you lose Jesus, you lose everything. You lose Jesus and the atmosphere will ignite. 7.5 billion years from now, when the sun turns into a red giant and expands and consumes our planet. Without Jesus, you lose everything. And so it's because of this conviction John has that he gives the church this exhortation. And here's what it is. We find it here in verse 8. Watch yourselves so that you may not lose what we have worked for, but may win a full reward. Watch yourselves. So I was a New England Patriots fan for 20 years. It was a glorious 20 years. We made it to the Super Bowl 9 times, won the Super Bowl 6 times. And for New England Patriots fans, there was sort of this saying that we all knew, and it was this saying, it was, "In Bill we trust." Bill Belichick, the coach of the New England Patriots. We had such a reign of success that it was like, well, whatever he decides, I'm sure it's the right decision. Now, if you're following the NFL now, that's been called into question in recent years. But for 2 solid decades, it was "In Bill we trust." And if you were a player for the New England Patriots, you always wanted to be on his good side. And of course, there were things that you would do that he wouldn't like, and you could get, it wouldn't look good. It was, well, I'll kind of put it this way. In the New England Patriots organization under Bill Belichick, there was sin that led to death, and then there was sin that doesn't lead to death. If I can use some terminology from 1 John, which we looked at last week. Right? John talks about there being sin that leads to death and sin that doesn't lead to death. And in the New England Patriots organization, that was true too. There was sin that doesn't lead to death. Like you're going to get in trouble with Bill, but you're still going to play. So like if you got a pass interference call, that was sin, but it wouldn't lead to death. Or a false start, or if you misread a read or something like that. Okay, you'd get in trouble, but that wasn't the end of the world. That was just sin. But then there was sin that leads to death. There was one thing that if you did as a New England Patriots player, if you did this, you might as well call your family and your friends and tell them to not even bother coming to the next game because you weren't going to play. What was that sin? It was if you fumbled the ball. You play for the Patriots and you fumble the ball, you're on the bench. You're not playing till who knows when. Why? Because in football, if you lose the ball, you lose everything. And so Bill Belichick is telling them all the time, watch yourself. Cling to that football. John's saying the same thing. He's saying, cling to Jesus. Watch yourself. Watch yourself, because there are influences in this world that want to try to knock that ball out. Everywhere you go, there's going to be some influence trying to knock Jesus out of your grip. And he's saying, cling to Jesus like a running back clings to a football. Now, of course, I think we have to be careful here, because it would be easy to read what John says here in 2 John and just say, well, gosh, I need to remove myself from the world. Right? He says, well, don't even, close the door, don't welcome them in. And you could take this and be like, well, gosh, I shouldn't hang out with non-Christians. I shouldn't invite them into my home. I shouldn't be involved, because what if they knock the ball out, right? But of course, this is where we have to read 2 John in light of Scripture as a whole. And of course, when we do that, we realize, hey, we are actually the means through which redemption is to come. We are the light to the nations. We have to be in the world. We have to be engaged in the world. We can't just cloister ourselves, huddle ourselves away, and hold on to Jesus, right? Just like a football player, when he's handed the ball, he can't just run the opposite direction. He has to run into where there is opposition. And so similarly, we have to do the same. We have to be willing to be in this world, but we have to cling tightly to Jesus as we do so. We have to watch ourselves. And I think to a certain extent what this means is we can't get lazy. Mentally, we can't get lazy. We have to, and here's where I want to bring up a verse that I think sums up very well how this applies to us today. 2 Corinthians 10:5 says this, take captive every thought and make it obedient to Christ. This means in every situation you're in, you need to be thinking through what you're hearing from others, from the world, whatever it is, and you need to be analyzing it in light of the gospel. And you can't get lazy about that. You've got to be thinking. I'll give you an example of where I did this recently. My family and I, we were watching the Barbie movie. And as I'm watching the Barbie movie, I'm just thinking about it in light of the gospel, and this is where it gets hard, right? Because as you watch the Barbie movie, there are some themes in it that are spot on. Like, this is exactly in line with the Christian faith. And one of the things a message that I saw that came out of it was this idea that you shouldn't let your culture define your identity, or don't let society define who you are. And that's it, praise the Lord. But then the problem was, the answer seemed to be, you just need to create your own identity. Right? You determine who you are. And of course, at that point, it's like, well, no, wait a minute. No, God is the one who determines our identity. Our worth and our value is determined by Him. You see, we have to approach the world in a way in which we're taking captive every thought and making it obedient to Christ. Watch yourself, John says. Cling to Jesus. Because listen, if you lose Jesus, you lose everything. But if you have Jesus, you have everything. We now come to our time of communion.